Hello, everyone. Welcome to Athenaeum 79. I'm your host, Niksa. And today we have with us Professor Stephen C. Berkwitz. Now, Sir is a professor of religious studies and department head of languages, culture, and religions at Missouri State University, USA. He obtained a PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, with a dissertation on medieval Buddhist historiography in Sri Lanka. His research focuses on Sinhala literature and Buddhist culture in Sri Lanka from the medieval up to the contemporary periods. He has published numerous books and articles on Buddhist history, poetry, kingship, colonialism, and modern Buddhist culture. His books include Buddhist history in the vernacular, the power of the past in late medieval Sri Lanka, and Buddhist poetry and colonization. Also, South Asian Buddhism, a survey, second edition. These are some books which we have written, and which he has written, and we are so glad to have him on our podcast as the guest today. How are you feeling, sir?
Yes, hello, Niharika. I'm feeling good, and I'm very happy to join you and to
Thank you
talk
so
about
much.
things of interest.
Yes, so our conversations will revolve around intellectual interests, academic biographies, publications, the future research options the scope he's looking forward at. To begin with, the most fundamental question, what caused you to focus your research on Sri Lankan Buddhism?
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's a good. I get that question a lot, quite honestly. There's several probably different responses for that, or answers to that question. So I knew that I wanted to study Theravada Buddhism. That was a form of Buddhism that interested me most. And I was particularly interested in studying a living tradition of Buddhism, and not solely texts that did not have a community of practitioners around them anymore. And so interested in Theravada, so that gave me a few choices. I think, gravitated to Sri Lanka more so than, say, Thailand or Myanmar, probably because Sri Lanka has such a long history, a pretty well documented history of Theravada Buddhism, and impressive collection of texts that have been composed there. Living tradition, it's still very influential and vibrant. Um, and I think I also should say that I wanted to be able to work in a language that was not tonal. So Sinhala is much closer to Pali and Sanskrit than Burmese or Thai or Khmer, and so that also probably had something to do with it. Um, so yeah, I've focused on Sri Lankan Buddhism. It's not a large field, but I think the people who work in it are quite dedicated and doing fantastic research.
Right, sir. Actually, in fact, Buddhism has expanded so much over the years that it has left its birthplace. Where when we study Buddhism also in our courses in honors in history, we the one thing that we realize is that Buddhism has traveled everywhere except the place where it was really like born or originated. We see different forms of Buddhism going furthermore into the history. For example, I'm here in Northeast, so there are different sorts of Buddhism practiced here. Many people have different variants of the kind of worship they want to opt for uh, in the same family itself. So that is a very nuanced and a very detailed sort of research field that you have chosen, I must say. And it also, I think it's very transnational because when you really connect Buddhism to India or different countries, you see a lot of similarities and a lot of connecting links between over the years. So, moving forward, what kind of topics have you mainly published on in your books and articles? And since you said you worked on a specific Buddhist culture and also that you wanted to focus on a living tradition. What really inspired you to focus on a living tradition more? Because there is a lot of skepticism revolving around the living traditions, and especially which my dissertation also revolved around, which is oral history, and we have a lot of problem in kind of deciphering the true element behind it, because these are just narratives coming from different sects of people and their experiences. The kind of research, the kind of sources that we look for in terms of historical research is more primary, more government based sources, which are more normative, prescriptive in nature. So I think this is a very unique and a very far-fetched approach to study Buddhism. I would like to know more about that.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Um, well, I think I would say, first of all, that my interests are not so much, my interests in Buddhist history are not so much to perhaps you could say reconstruct what actually happened in the past, which is sort of a discovery model of doing history, um, but more how history has been perceived and used. I guess perceived, constructed, and used by Buddhist adherents. Um, so it's one of the distinctive features of Buddhism in Sri Lanka is that they long had a very very long and detailed historiographical tradition. Um, and specifically, the genre is called the vamsa, kind of a chronicle or a lineage, literally meaning bamboo, but it's a term that has been utilized in many pre-modern texts composed in Sri Lanka that recount or recall the sort of history of how Buddhism was established um, in India or the subcontinent, but more specifically in Sri Lanka, how it was introduced and established in Sri Lanka. And so this sense of welcoming and establishing the Buddha's dispensation or sasana in the island of Sri Lanka is a pretty formative notion for Buddhist identity in the island. Um, and scholars who discovered these texts, on the one hand, were I'm talking about 19th century, early 20th century scholars that discovered that these texts exist. They're very excited because here we have a kind of a native South Asian historiographical tradition that, um, while not completely reliable in terms of a kind of a historiographical sense, a Western historiographical sense, um, it was still rooted in facts, and this was something that interested a lot of Western scholars, and they used the Vamsa text to try to understand this sort of or discover this history of Sri Lanka, um, and that's I think interesting. But I'm more interested in reading those historical Vamsa texts um, and detecting what their interests are, because in many cases the authors of the Vamsas were not interested in creating the same kind of sober, reliable history that modern scholars would be interested in producing. So um, I was interested, and I've published quite a bit on this sort of Buddhist sense of history and looking at how these texts were composed, how what they tell us about um, sort of Buddhist thought and practice in ancient and medieval times, and how these narratives sort of worked to give to, I guess you could say, even sort of reinforce or help to develop a religious, or let's say a Buddhist practice. Um, and so writing about the past, whether or not it is always accurate, has been an important feature in Sri Lankan Buddhism. And so that's where a lot of my research has been focused on. And I continue to do work in this area because there is a large collection of texts. Most of the Pali literature, Pali language vamsas have been studied and translated. Not all, but most have. But I've been particularly interested in looking at the Sinhala language vamsa texts, which have barely been studied outside of Sri Lanka. Um, and even in Sri Lanka, they haven't been studied in any kind of comprehensive fashion. So it's always fun to kind of come across a new body of literature that has not received much scholarly attention before. So that's one of the things I like to do, is looking at how these Buddhist historical narratives work to shape um, identity and practice within a kind of long-standing Buddhist tradition. But I took a different, went in a different direction with my study of Sinhala Buddhist literature, a little over a decade ago, when I started to look at some poetry. So there is also a very vibrant, extensive collection of Sinhala poetry, most of which has, in the pre-modern era, based on Buddhist themes, Buddhist ideas, Buddhist narratives, previous lives of the Buddha, for example, or the Jataka stories are a main, pretty common feature in Buddhist poetry. Um, and I just wanted to learn how to read poetry and to kind of study and interpret those types of texts. And so I focused on the poetic works of someone who's kind of considered the last classical poet in the Sinhala tradition, a man named Alagiyavanna Mukaveti, who lived between the latter part of the 16th century and the first couple decades of the 17th century. And he was thought to have written at least 5 significant poetic works that we still have today. But what's so interesting about Alagiyavanna is that he lived and composed poetry at the very time when Western colonizers, specifically the Portuguese, arrived in Sri Lanka. And so this was a very important and disruptive historical period. And here is this poet who is still, at least in his early career, writing poetry that is almost trying to keep these traditions alive. Um, Later on, and this is equally interesting, if not more so, he actually changes his style of poetry. And we have records that shows that he converted to Catholicism and started working for the Portuguese, assisting their officials on conducting land surveys and kind of revenue records. And so it's a really interesting chapter in not only Sri Lankan history, but we might say Asian history in general. And the poetic works are really fun to read and creative. And so that's another sort of topic that I've enjoyed doing some work on. Um, Smaller kind of projects that have emerged out of these two interests have led me to take a look at some depictions or portrayals of Buddhist kings. particularly in this sort of second millennium of Sri Lankan history. Um, you'd say, from 10 or 1000 to about 1700. Um, so that's been a project that I've been interested in. And again, partly to sort of focus more so on the local depictions of kingship rather than trying to detect or discover what kingship actually looked like. So I'm someone who likes to read Buddhist texts and examine how they portray reality and how they um, describe worlds and communicate values that are hard to discover in other ways.
It's very interesting that you talk about the Western historical approaches and how you are going away from it to kind of study the literature and to derive history from literature, because there is another whole level of psychological understanding you need to develop to get into the brains of these and heads of these people, to see what were they thinking, or what kind of situations were they going through, or what was the political environment of that time, what was the social context they all lived in, and to kind of derive it all in an abstract sense, starting from an abstract sense, in a full circle, in a holistic manner, from the texts that you have been reading, and especially um, the Sinhalese language. It's rightly said, very less discovered. And I think Sri Lankan history in itself is very old. If we really go back into ancient history, we have a lot of scope of, I think, research, and a lot of scope in not only studying Buddhism, but that country in itself. It has a long tradition of religions, and then and also that you talked about this Portuguese invasion. Seems funny that this guy converted and then he started working. It takes a level of experience, I think, to get into that zone where the Portuguese people will appoint you as someone to do the land surveys, because then you have to be a mediator between the common people and these European people who have just entered your land, and they have no idea about you, and they want you to kind of be a mediator but still hold the same power. But something doing something on that scale in 16th century is mind blowing, and you studying about it is mind blowing. So many of your work, they focus on Sinhalese Buddhist literature. What really caused you to work on this material, and how has this specific research shaped your views or understanding of the Buddhist history, not only of Sri Lanka, but of the connecting contemporary Buddhist practices that you see across the world, or you might be able to relate to in your real life when you meet Buddhists, and when you kind of understand their understanding or their perspective or their narrative of their own religion?
Okay, yeah, that's a good
Mm.
those are good questions. Yeah, I think I'm a big proponent of not limiting one's study of Buddhism to the classical and canonical texts. So they're certainly important, and it's important to be able to access, in my field, Pali language literature, which has been foundational for the development of what we now call Theravada all across Southern Asia. Um, and then, there are other traditions where Sanskrit literature or classical Chinese and classical Tibetan become foundational too. Um, so I don't want to, I want to be sure that I'm not mistaken for saying that those texts are not important. They are important. Um, but I don't think they give us the full picture. And so, again, early on in my academic career, I sort of, I think, realized that it would add a great deal to my research to be able to look at Buddhist texts written in vernacular languages that were more accessible to a wider group of people. Um, so, as I'm sure you know, there was no one in Sri Lanka who was born speaking Pali. It was not something that families spoke to each other. You'd learn it if you were a monastic, or if you were a scholar, perhaps a lay scholar, but most people wouldn't speak it. So texts written in Pali were fairly circumscribed to a small audience of people. Now, of course, a Pali text could then travel outside of Sri Lanka, and they did, and go to what we now call Myanmar, or Thailand, and Cambodia. There are texts that authored originally in Sri Lanka, but were brought to other places. And as long as they were written in Pali, monks who were trained in Pali had access to it. And this is sort of the same with Sanskrit, or classical Chinese, or these are texts that would have been used by well-educated readers in different countries. Now, but the vernacular languages, which I think the field of Buddhist studies has been fairly slow to recognize and pay attention to, these are texts that ostensibly had more use in a particular culture. They were communicated more frequently. They could have been read from in social settings and in domestic settings in some cases. Certainly used by monastics who would preach sermons to people. So there's a sense in which texts written in the vernacular, or I should say a literary vernacular, because they're not necessarily written in the language that people spoke, on a kind of day-to-day level, an informal level. There's still some stylistic elements that make it more of a written language than a spoken language, but it would be more understandable. And these are texts that people could have listened to, some cases read, and received information about Buddhism or whatever the subject happened to be. So I wanted to, it was in graduate school, actually, when I was in Santa Barbara, where I kind of naively stumbled upon the fact that there is this sizable collection of Buddhist literature from Sri Lanka that I had never heard about. And that's because it is written in literary Sinhala as opposed to Pali. And there are very few Western scholars researching that. And so this became a kind of new to me challenge, kind of an exciting challenge to learn how to read literary Sinhala, pre-modern Sinhala, and then begin to learn what these texts were saying, what picture, or what sort of images, what sort of ideas they contributed to the development of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And so I still work with Pali to some degree. I don't do very much with Sanskrit, but I do most of my work with Sinhala, because there are still scores of Sinhala Buddhist texts that no one has really studied as religious literature.
That's amazing. I mean, everyone has a story of why they started researching in a particular topic, in a particular niche, and how they found out that this was what they were meant to do. And yours is very intriguing because it's a whole different, it takes a whole different level of confidence to get into a new language completely just for the sake of your research work. And that is something that's a huge step, I think, you took for the sake of academics. So, how would you, in your understanding of the Theravada culture that you have studied for now, how, in your understanding, how would you characterize the fields of Buddhist studies and Theravada studies right now, and how they're approached by numerous scholars who are studying about it, and the scholars that might be looking forward to exploring new, I would say, nuances or different variants of the study per se, even in terms of literature, even in terms of, I would say, history in general, classical history, and through other different disciplines as well. What do you think is the scope that this subject offers for now?
Yeah, it's, I think it's my view of this issue is sort of mixed. So on the one hand, um, I think certainly in North America, to some degree in Europe, I can't speak to higher education, universities in India, but there is a certain we're in a phase or a cycle, you might say, where humanistic studies and research has been uh, maybe, I don't want to say looked down upon, but not valued as much as it has in the past. And so it's difficult for younger scholars like yourself and other people who want to go into this field to um, obtain a position in a graduate, in a doctoral program, and then obtain a full-time um, university position as a teacher. Um, and this is not just the case with Buddhist studies. I think this is true more generally about the humanities in my in American society, especially, but others as well. Um, People seem to be shifting some resources away from the humanities towards sort of science and technology, which is also important, but I think we lose a lot when we stop exercising the skills that we need to understand history and to understand literature and to just sort of be able to communicate and interpret how people act in the world. Um, so that's a little bit of a pessimistic view. The more optimistic view is that I think the research, even though the circumstances are somewhat difficult to work in, the research is in recent years has been pretty exciting. I think that um, there continue to be really excellent books, articles published in Buddhist studies as a whole. Um, I do think people are learning from their forebearers and the scholars who came before them, and learning to perhaps add more nuance or build upon those foundations of earlier generations of scholars, many of whom were tremendous researchers themselves. Um, so the work continues to be done, the work continues to be good. I think in the field of Theravada studies, there seems to be an impressive and encouraging resurgence of some younger scholars that are taking the field in new directions. I do think that there's probably, let's say, arguably in Buddhist studies as a whole, but also in Theravada studies as a subsection of that, maybe more attention put on contemporary Buddhist communities and practices. Um, Sometimes this is called lived Buddhism, and it's found in Asia, to be sure, but it's found in other parts of the world too. And so, I think there's been an expansion of where we look to study Buddhism. So it can be done not only in traditional Buddhist Asian Buddhist countries, but it can be in Europe, it can be in North America, it can be in South America. I recently heard of a conference being put together on the subject of Buddhism in Africa. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not as um, certainly practiced or is known about at the same level in all of these different places. Um, but we're learning that Buddhism in the 21st century continues to be a dynamic tradition that is being practiced and reinterpreted in sometimes novel ways. I also think there the sort of attitude or the approach that I've taken by adding a study of vernacular literature, that's becoming slightly more common too. There's a sort of general recognition that there is value in reading texts in Thai, for example, or Khmer, or Burmese, or what have you, of course, Sinhala, that I think younger scholars are recognizing that that's an important element too. Um, Now, of course, Theravada being a living Buddhist tradition sort of welcomes that or perhaps encourages that the development of those language skills. But I think there's a general understanding that in order to get a fuller kind of historical picture of a given text or thinker or tradition, maybe a school, um, we need to be able to look at a wider range of materials. And that can also include things that are not written. So, material culture. I think um, there's a greater awareness and interest in learning about Buddhism or studying Buddhism from archaeology and from art history and from contemporary kind of ritual practice that texts are important, but there are other sources of research too that we can use.
A very interesting because how you pointed out that the kind of research in Buddhist traditions which is not well uh, not completely valued in the right sense that you said, humanistic studies, kind of everyone putting every subject, every discipline into a more empirical research and trying to push it towards STEM and giving it a scientific approach. I was reading about I was reading political science an article recently, and there's always this in humanities. There's always this numerous constant flux of definitions that will follow because no one will agree on a single thing and it's a lived experience. So one experience for one cannot be the same for the other person, and all it takes is acknowledgement from both sides. It cannot be 1 plus 1 is 2, or 1 and 2 is 2. It can't be that. It's not mathematical in nature. Also, how you pointed out that studying literature from different countries across the world has also kind of gained more importance and is being followed kind of more rigorously as compared to what it was before. And the African presentation or the conference you were talking about, how many places have you visited across the world, and how many people, how many real Buddhist people have you met, and what kind of and the interactions with them, what conclusions did it give you about the contemporary Buddhism that is followed and the kind of understanding these all people have in different countries and how it connects to just one root, maybe something that talks about the essence of Buddhism that all of them have in common, but at the same time there's so many some differences among them, whereas they follow the same culture. And of course, talking about the material history, uh, In fact, my dissertation was based on field research and oral history. So it's very difficult to put fingers and be empirical about it. You can have an empirical observation of yourself, but it cannot be scientific in nature because it's not practically possible. It's a culture that is followed, and it's a living culture. It's a living tradition. People do it on a day-to-day basis. So it's not something that has been jotted down in books already, but it's an everyday act. For example, if you talk about partition of India, there were during the partition, of course, India was going through a lot of turmoil. But for now, over the period of time, uh, historians have realized how important it is to capture history when it is happening, like right now in the moment. So we have study centers for COVID, interviewing people and asking people about what were their experiences in COVID, and how has COVID shaped them or kind of changed their lives. Similarly, many people, very few people who are actually alive from the 1947 partition of India, they are being interviewed by Delhi University. I mean, there's a special, I think, center of studies open for them, and they're interviewing them. So it's kind of, it's how history, when the past merges with the present, because there's really not much difference between humans. Uh, we're all, we're all the same, and we are all trying to do and reach one goal. So I would love to know more about the narratives that you have gone through across the world, and how has it kind of given you a true essence of what Buddhism means, or and how it is interpreted.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's a tough question. I've traveled a fair amount, not as much as I would like. I would like to travel more. I've traveled places and not had any contact with Buddhists, so I can't pretend to suggest that everywhere I go, I have an interaction with someone who's Buddhist. But um, I think, generally speaking, the availability of information about Buddhism, the sort of level of interest about Buddhism, maybe not to practice or to become a Buddhist, but to learn about it and to maybe meditate. I think there are things that are quite broadly popular across the world. That would be a pretty daunting, a pretty huge research project to be able to study and quantify exactly where this, to give evidence for that. But it's certainly the case that in certain places where the history of Buddhism has been in decline, we're finding some resurgence. I'm thinking of China, for example. There seems to be some modest growth of Buddhist communities, traditions in the People's Republic of China. Certainly, we know a little bit about Nepal, um, even Bangladesh, where there might be some um, attempts to revive and strengthen a Buddhist tradition that has been present for many centuries, but has been maybe somewhat weak. Um, and this is partly one of the consequences of we might describe as globalization. So people and information travel great distances more quickly than ever before. So it's possible to learn about Buddhism no matter where you are if you have access to the internet and are interested in learning about it. Um, but I think more generally, one of the reasons why a book that I wrote, South Asian Buddhism, and I just recently published a second edition with updated research. One of the reasons why I took on that project was I felt that too many sort of survey texts of Buddhism in India or South Asia in general um, tended to stop around the 12th century where Buddhism goes into a quick, kind of rapid decline in the subcontinent. Doesn't disappear altogether. That's the kind of common historical narrative. It doesn't disappear then, but it becomes more marginalized. Um, is that there continue to be, even up to this day, vibrant contemporary Buddhist communities all across South Asia. Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, of course, but even in different parts of India, you have practicing Buddhists, and these are the story of these revivals. I think are important for our understanding of Buddhism as well, and learning, who is it and why are they looking to Buddhism or trying to revive it and spread it again. Can it ever be as widely practiced as it was in, pre-Gupta period? Probably not, but it's still something that I think interests people and is meaningful for certain communities, whether they are immigrants from, let's say, Tibet or Bangladesh, who both have had welcomed Buddhists into India in the 20th century and continually so today in the 21st century, or whether there are people who have been in their families have been in India for a long time. The Dalit community in Maharashtra, for example. But even I think there are some people who have just found Buddhism to be fascinating, and they might want to meditate, or they want to do something different. So one of the things I try to stress in my classes, but also in some of my research, is that Buddhism is not just an ancient history. It continues to have sort of relevance and interest for people today.
Right. I mean, that element of how the internet has shaped everyone's understanding of Buddhism and how it continues to expand in popular culture through certain practices, through certain rituals that might interest a particular population. For example, I really like the Tibetan singing bowl. It has an amazing vibe to it because I got it from one of the monasteries I visited last year. And yes, it definitely adds to a popular understanding because not everyone can be so intrigued to read about the exact origins because as we see that it long left India after its origination and the rapid decline that we see after the 12th century. So my final question would be, and one of the most interesting one, I see that you have visited many places for your field research also. What is the one place that you would advise everyone to visit if they were in that particular city or country? And moving forward in terms of academics, what research plans do you have for future? Does it revolve around Buddhism or does it expands more into different areas or scopes of studies? I would love to know.
Okay, yeah, thank you for those
Yeah.
questions. Wow. So, I'm still not surprisingly a big proponent of visiting Sri Lanka. I think, and it's quite easy for people in India to make that trip, even in the north. It's a long flight, but it's still, accessible. Um, there's so many temples, some of which are quite old, um, that you can visit. Not so much in Colombo, let's say, but in the ancient capitals of Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa. There are some pretty still stunning structures and sites to visit. Um, so that's something I would encourage anyone to look at if they can. But if you have a good guide or driver, there are temples that are hundreds of years old, scattered throughout the country that hardly anyone visits, and it's quite interesting to go to some of these lesser known temples, just to sort of see, I guess you get a sense of how the religion was established and spread across the country, and how it continues to have some degree of, I mean, there's certainly temples that are generally almost even forgotten about, but and some that are overrun with worshipers. But it's interesting to sort of see the variety of temples that are can be found in a place like Sri Lanka. Um, Gosh, there's so many. It would be difficult to begin to even name them, but I think there's one actually. Gosh, I think north central Sri Lanka. It would be hard to get to. Buduru Yaya, which is the image of the Buddha, is the name of the temple, and there's this very long image of the Buddha in the parinirvana style of lying on one side as he passes away. It's been damaged, but it's probably 800 years old and just lying in the middle of a jungle next to this temple that you can go, and probably no one else will be there except for the monks who live there. And so that's kind of a neat experience. Doesn't have a lot to do with my future research, although I do go to Sri Lanka as often as I can. What I'd like to do is sort of continue some of the projects that I've been working on for my career. I have another translation project I'd like to do, a work that I've read and I've translated, and I'm in the process of cleaning it up and finding references that would be useful, of the history of the Bodhi tree in the Sinhala version, or the Sinhala Bodhivamsa, is a text that I've been working with for some time, and I would like to publish a translation of, just because there's interest in the Bodhi trees. They're an important part of popular Buddhist practice in Sri Lanka, at least. And it's, these are historical narratives that tell the story of why these are important as in a kind of religious context. I'd also like to write a kind of culminating project, maybe, on the role of vernacular literature in pre-modern Sri Lankan Buddhism. So really try to, I've been looking at pieces of it, but I'd like to synthesize all of this research and add some new studies, new texts, to sort of try and figure out, what does it mean to bring Buddhism to the general public? How is that done? What sorts of facets of the tradition are elevated and emphasized? What things might not be? And it's not, it goes beyond the simple monastic versus lay dichotomy, because I think in many cases these vernacular texts were important for monastics as well. So I'd like to do a large project that looks at what I would call vernacular Buddhism, particularly in Sri Lanka, but with an eye to making an argument about expanding the kinds of texts that we read when we study Buddhism. And those are probably my two biggest projects that I see on the horizon. And at that point, when I finish those, I'll probably just retire and read for fun.
I think that it's a very uh, I would say important project that you would be working on, because even talking about vernacular literature in itself is a big base that you will create for future, even the Bodhi tree narrative or the story talked about in vernacular or the Sinhalese literature especially. I mean, it will create a base for the future generation or the future academic scope of whoever tries to pursue Buddhist studies later on in their postgraduate studies. And other than that, having a narrative about vernacular languages in itself will show how important vernacular languages are in terms of interpreting any history, any piece of literature, any country, because we see that the history of the common people is not really written in these books. The history of the common people is heard through these oral stories and this materialistic culture or the public history that we have kind of now developed the approaches to, and that is really important to look at, because if we don't do that, the history that we study kind of creates I don't know if it's the right word, but it creates a propaganda around what we study and what we must study and what must come in exams and what we must know and what we must write and what information we must fill our brains with. So that really that's kind of a soft power that we as a generation we must change and we must look forward to explore more. And other than that, definitely the kind of oral history that you are looking forward at, it's going to help future generations in their scholarship a lot. Also, I really appreciate the fact that you went to temples which are like 800 years old, which do not have many people and are not crowded. Because one thing which I also experienced during my research is that this commercialization of temples and monasteries, it leads to a lot of I would say money making or business, but in reality, it really loses, it kind of detaches you from the essence of what purpose that monastery was to serve, or the kind of real traditions that it held and it practiced. So it's really important to definitely visit the monasteries and the temples and whatever religious places you have. Those are not really commercialized. And not visited by much people, because these are the places where you will see the most authentic forms of rituals and traditions and practices, and how they have evolved over the years. And these monks talk about, because they also have their generations and their lineages of monks, and the kind of knowledge they have. It's raw information. Even interviewing them, it's raw information that you can use to interpret religion in general. So thank you so much, sir. It was really a pleasure. I am so glad we could have this conversation, and it really kinds of opens me up now to study about Buddhist studies of Sri Lanka, especially. And I definitely look forward to reading your next publications and your future research projects about the vernacular languages and the Bodhi tree narrative. Thank you so much again for coming on the podcast and taking out your time. Are there any notes you would like to end with?
Oh, no, just thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about my background and research. Flattered that you were interested, and I hope other people find it interesting too. But this has been a great pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope to have another session with you as soon as possible, whenever you publish next, and we'll connect soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye now.